It's James Black here. I'm with Danielle Goldfarb, Head of Global Research at RIWI Corp. RIWI is listed on the CSE, symbol RIW. And you guys have been here listed for a couple of years now. And I know, obviously, your team and Neil and everyone else that's part of the family there. But maybe, Danielle, tell me a little bit today on our Instagram Live about what you guys are doing at RIWI, the mission statement that you guys follow every day at your company, because you've been publishing all sorts of awesome work. You were just published in Maclean's, but what's the mission? It's probably quite relevant to today's circumstances.
So, I mean, we're really looking to get clean data signals on what's truly happening in real time, essentially.
Right.
So, I mean, we have actually our origins in pandemic surveillance. So the company and the technology that we use was originally developed to about, over 10 years ago when we had another pandemic during the H1N1 crisis and the H1N1 outbreak rather. And the idea was the technology was designed to understand how the public was responding to that outbreak, and to understand that in real time across multiple countries. And so, lo and behold, we find ourselves now, and we've tracked many epidemic outbreaks since then. And now, of course, we find ourselves in this COVID-19 situation. And so we are basically surveilling in real time every aspect of this crisis, or we're able to surveil in real time many, many different aspects of this crisis. Everything from the changing prevalence of disease in Canada and around the world, the changing prevalence of symptoms, of testing, of compliance with these public health directives, or lack thereof. And then as well, we are also able to track in real time a lot of the economic aspects of the crisis. So what are both the actual impacts and the psychological, so both the sort of what's truly happening now in terms of employment and incomes, but also what are the psychological impacts? What are the fears people have, and how will that play out in the next phases of the epidemic? So basically, we're in the business of real time tracking of what's truly happening, and testing sort of the assumptions that people have against the reality of what's truly happening.
Right, and I assume your data points aren't just being collected through mass media, platforms like Fox News and CNN, or even more, The Economist or whatever. You guys are getting primary data, is that correct? You guys are collecting primary data?
Yeah. So the core concept behind the technology is this idea that we don't want to just get access to opinion from the types of people that would typically respond to a survey, or the narrow group of us that are on social media. So, social media excludes vastly more voices and perspectives than it includes. And so the idea behind the technology is that we want to get access to the broadest set of respondents we can possibly get access to. So social media, you're getting a lot of responses, you get big data, but it's from a narrow group of voices. We're trying to expand that. We want to hear from the widest set of voices possible, because that gives you more predictive, more accurate information about what's truly happening. So we're hearing from ordinary people. It's a machine learning technology for which anybody online has an equal chance of being exposed to our questions. And so the idea is that we're getting access to, whether it's urban, rural, across all parts of this country, but also across all parts of the US, every part of China, in which people have access to the internet. So whether they're on a smartphone or desktop, computer or tablet, we want to hear from them. We want to get a random sampling of opinion on a continuous basis. That's basically the idea of how the technology works.
Interesting. And how does that data get collected? Is it through a voluntary completion of data submission?
Yeah. So
okay.
So the idea is that we expose, so anybody online has a random chance of being exposed to the questions, and then they can choose whether they answer them or not. And I should also mention one other important aspect of the data collection, which is that we do not capture any personally identifiable information, and we don't incentivize anybody to complete the survey. So the idea behind that is really, again, we want to get access to true opinion, true sentiment. We want to make sure we get the access to the widest group of opinion, and we want to make sure that, particularly when we're capturing data in places where people are not freely able to share their opinion, and we're active in many parts of the world for which this is the case, we want to make sure that their personally identifiable information is not attached to their answers.
Yeah, what's the challenge in capturing bias in from someone who, if their opinions were made public knowledge, they could be persecuted? Like, how do you work with that paradigm?
So we really take security and privacy very, very seriously. So we've got a number of protocols in place to make sure that we do not, we're not capturing any personally identifiable information, anything that could link a person to their contact information. And that's a key reason why we don't, one of the many reasons why we don't pay people or otherwise incentivize them to complete surveys. So we're doing surveys in all parts of the world where, and on some of the most socially sensitive issues, you know, from looking, you know, people's opinions on lesbians and gays, you know, in countries for which this behavior is criminalized. So we are, in mental health, we're doing a huge study right now on mental health in North America amongst college and university students. And both, we happen to start data collection before the pandemic, and we're doing it so we can see what happened and how the impact after the pandemic. But we want to make sure that we are hearing from people what their true opinion is, their true behavior is, and that they're able to speak freely. So we take that very, very seriously, and you know, we're not collecting any of that information at all.
Right, and what I love about what you guys are putting out there is you're debunking and challenging commonly accepted assumptions about what's presented to us in the media. So can you maybe talk about some of these prevailing assumptions
Sure.
in the context of COVID-19 that your research is actually, you know, creating counterpoints around, or at least correcting or giving a more in-depth understanding of?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing is that we can't make any assumptions. Yeah, I mean, that's
you can't inject yourself with Clorox and cure the disease.
Oh yeah, that's a bad assumption for me.
That was a good one.
So you really, I mean, the one thing that I think we need to, you know, consistently remind ourselves of is that things are changing rapidly, and you know what's true in this in a particular phase of the epidemic in each country is not necessarily going to be the same thing in the next phase. You know, at the same time, we're hearing a lot about, oh, everything's changed. Nobody's gonna book a cruise anymore, but yet cruise ship bookings are up. So, you know, everything's changed, and yet, you know, like some people are saying everything's changed, other people have said nothing's changed. And the reality is we have to just check our assumptions against reality basically on a daily basis. And that's really what we're trying to do, is we're trying to monitor these things on a daily basis. So I'll give you an example of one thing that we're monitoring in China. If that's okay.
Yeah, please. No.
Yeah. So one of the things that's very interesting that I find, you know, really fascinating, we've been tracking this consumer confidence in China basically since the beginning of the trade war and the Kennedy-West trade war, which seems like ancient history right now. But you know, there was this trade war, and everybody, you know, and during that whole time, you know, consumer confidence was actually relatively stable in our data. And then as soon as the pandemic hit, we actually saw a drop in our consumer confidence data, and we're tracking this, of course, in Hubei province, which is from which the virus originated, and consumer confidence dropped by quite a bit more in that province as well, as you would expect. But the interesting thing that's happening is that it didn't drop by that much. And, you know, so this was in the first couple of months of the pandemic, or the epidemic outbreak in China. But we're seeing now something very different as the economy reopens. There's a lot of narrative about that out there, about, you know, China's economy is reopening. They're trying to gradually get back to normal. But we're actually seeing an increase in the number of people, a significant increase right now in the number of people who think it is not a good time. They're not sure if it's a good time to make a major purchase right now. So there was a lot of uncertainty throughout the entire period of the trade war, throughout the entire first couple weeks of the epidemic, couple months of the epidemic. But now, as we're heading into this kind of new period of reopening, we're actually seeing a greater amount of uncertainty. And that's being reflected in some of the consumer spending data that's coming out of China. So we're at a different phase of the outbreak. The assumptions are, you know, we may have seen something in the past couple of months. We can't assume that's going to be the case for this phase. And that's a caution to those of us in North America. Just because we're seeing something right now you know, next month as we start to head into reopening in various parts of Canada and the US, we need to test those assumptions against reality, and we need to do it like every day, not just, you know, at the end of the month.
Yeah, is China how much of what their sentiment is and what they plan to do with their reopening of their economy relates to what we should be listening to over here as guidance, or just as an example that we can translate into our worldview and our economic startup plan? Because I mean, it's a very different country. It's obviously you guys are trying to capture the information that you are, but very different values of society. Are we to look at what we're seeing there and use anything reliable out of that, or just say, look, that's them and we're us and we have to make our own decisions?
I mean, I think we have to do both. So you know, we have to look at what's happening there because they have gone through a similar period of the outbreak. You know, they're at a different phase, and we have to look at what we can learn from it. And I think because it is a cautionary tale in terms of what assumptions, you know, we need to challenge. But at the same time, you know, so for example, as they're reopening now, people are not, you know, they're reopening, but people aren't going out to restaurants yet, right? Yeah. So we have to think to ourselves, are we going to see the same thing? Are people going to be afraid to go to work? Are they going to be afraid to go to movies? Are they not going to book travel? And we're seeing in China, for example, they don't want to educate their children in the US anymore. There's actually some of our data that show that. So there are important lessons that we can take from what's happening in China, but we have to take them, of course, with a grain of salt because of the very, very different policy environment and other aspects of the situation in China. In North America, but yes, we have to sort of think about what is it that we are going to see coming, you know, we're going to see in the next couple of months here in North America. And I think, you know, there are going to be, well, the other thing is that in China as well, which we're tracking, is the degree to which various sectors have been resilient and less exposed to the pandemic. So, you know, for example, the tech sectors, we actually see employment growth in those sectors in our data. And so we want to be able to take some of those lessons as to what the economy and the sort of reshaping of the economy during this period and potentially beyond looks like. But, you know, we're looking at the data in Canada and the US and other parts of the world as well, because we can't assume that what applies to China applies to us as well. And we're looking also at, you know, places like Germany that are emerging to start looking, you know, to do some of this reopening sooner than us. Can we learn from places like Germany in real time about the impact of their reopening strategy? And can we apply some of those lessons to other parts of the world?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that it's critical to make those findings and look at them in isolation, and then broadly look at them on a global landscape, and then see how it all comes together. You really have a challenging job, which is to find all this stuff and make sense of it. One finding that I thought was fascinating, I'll let you explain it, but in McLean's, he talked about the juxtaposition of the impact on jobs in the US versus Canada. And there's been two vastly different painted narratives between how Canada is being impacted by COVID and how the US is. And and I think to me, it was interesting to see that impact from a Canadian perspective. Because I drew the same assumption that, hey, we're going to be okay, things are fine relative to what's happening in the U.S., but maybe not quite the case. Can you maybe just describe what you wrote about, and then what it is you know, we can get from that?
Okay, yeah. So in an article in Maclean's earlier this week that I co-wrote with Armin Yalnizyan on real time, you know, basically what we're able to see in our data in real time, and how we're missing part of the picture if we just rely on what we're seeing in the official jobs data and the official GDP estimates that have come out. So the data that we saw in both countries, in Canada and the US, on jobs come out, you know, a couple of weeks ago, basically reflected what was taking place in the early days of physical distancing. So they've seen, you know, they show important rises in unemployment in both countries, but really that's just the tip of the iceberg. And when we look at our data, we are starting to see into April, and it will take us, you know, for us to understand what happened in April in terms of the official data, we're going to have to wait till May and June to actually get the data of what's happening right now. So when we look at our data, we're doing this in real time, and what we see is actually a much more severe picture of what happened in the latter stages of March and April as the reality of the situation hit across
Yeah.
workers and businesses. And what we found is that 1 in 5 Canadians and 1 in 5 Americans are currently, more than that actually, in both countries, are currently unemployed according to our data. And we also found that if you measure income loss, so, jobs are one thing, but we know there's a lot of people who have multiple jobs who are employed in gig economy jobs, and that's not captured in the unemployment data. And so when we asked people about income loss, we actually found that about 1/3 of Canadians and 1/3 of Americans have lost half or more of their income. That
Wow.
is, that's a stat that's really, really significant. And I guess the question is, in both countries, there've been some huge policy moves. Will those mitigate these very severe impacts? How will that be impacted by reopening, gradual reopening? And and what can we expect to see here? Like, what are the psychological impacts of that as well? So those are the things we see. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a little scary, but I like that, movement to try to make decisions, or at least understand policy decisions that are effectively based on lagging indicators, right? There's no real-time numbers the government really has at their disposal to decide, because some of this policy was built on the fly. There's no precedent for it. I'm sure there's some strategic planning ahead of something like this that could be put into play, but 75% wage subsidy, was that something they had in their back pocket for this, or was that because they had some model,
No, and I think this is exactly what you're talking about. The government in Canada and the US and around the world are now being forced to make, what we call sort of agile policy. Like, they're trying to make decisions really that have to be made and then adjusted and then made again, then readjusted. And we're going to see this at every phase of the crisis. So, but the data that they're relying on is based on 6-week lags in some cases, not always, but in some cases, the jobs data is based on a significant lag, and that makes it very, very difficult. And not only is it lagged, but also it's not capturing all the dimensions of the crisis. So the degree to which people have access to paid sick leave, the degree to which their income is impacted, even if they don't have a traditional job. So these are all the kinds of things that, that I have the privilege of being able to look at right now, and to be able to say, okay, this is what we're truly seeing now in real time about people's actual behavior and their actual impact on their lives.
Yeah, and you mentioned in your last response about psychological impact, and how do you even measure that impact? How do you capture authentic data about that? But because you're basically asking someone to tell you how they feel. But then how do you extrapolate that or model it into the economy? Maybe just touch on how you guys deal with psychological measures, and then obviously insights.
Yeah, so this is really an important question, I think, because it's one thing to measure. So the official data we have is sort of looking at things through a rear view mirror. Then the data that I just talked about on unemployment rate and so on gives you kind of a current, like what's happening now in real time. But what we really want to know is what the future looks like, and we really want to be able to predict. And so that's why it's really important to be able to accurately measure the psychological aspects of this. So, I guess, anything from a traditional sort of consumer confidence type question where you're asking people, is now a good time to make your major purchase? What we're really looking for in that kind of question is really not, what happens today, but we're really looking for shifts, for inflection points. And I mentioned the one that we saw in China, where now people are uncertain as to whether that's a good thing to do or not. And so we're doing the same thing. We're looking for inflection points on a number of different psychological questions. So one, for example, right now, we're tracking various events in the U.S. For one, we're tracking the U.S. the current U.S. election, because we were accurately predicted the Trump election in 2016.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that.
We'll talk about that another time. But But one of the things we're tracking there right now are narratives that the population believes about their economic circumstances. So to what degree do they believe they're likely to lose their job? They're likely to regain their job. And one of the things that we're tracking, we've been tracking this since October before the outbreak, is this question of whether there will be a recession. in the US in 2020, and how severe, and we're starting to track this question of, how severe will this recession be? And the reason this is important is because what we really want to measure here is people's fear. So when you're trying to model what's going to happen in the economy, and we're seeing this, the central banks of both Canada and the US did not actually produce a forecast right now for the economy because we're so uncertain and people's GDP estimates are all over the place.
Yeah.
The key thing that's very, very difficult to predict, to model, is people's behavior and what their fears are. And so if people believe that there's going to be a very, very deep recession, that could actually lead to a deeper and more prolonged and more widespread economic crisis than otherwise would need to be the case. And this is the thesis of Robert Shiller, who's written this great book, Narrative Economics. And so we're testing whether that thesis is actually holding in real time. And as you'd expect in the US, there is, as soon as the crisis hit, yes, a greater share of the population believed there was a recession coming. We saw a huge shift in the data. And actually in the last week or two, we've actually seen a further shift. That's probably realistic that people think there's going to be a recession right now. But we're really monitoring the change in that. So are we going to see a dramatic, shift where, people have dropped out of the don't know category and they're very, very certain that this is going to happen? And that's what we're seeing in recent weeks, but it's not, it's where we expect it would be. And so we're monitoring to see, are people going to start talking about it so much that they're actually going to talk themselves into a more prolonged, deeper, more widespread recession? These are the kinds of things that we're looking at.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, recession is almost like like the boogeyman, a word you can't say in certain circles in the economy, especially in the US. You don't want to be caught saying it without some real justification, because as you say, right, those who watch mass media produce television, things like that, they take it to heart. They take it very seriously, and it can impact their ability to psychologically, I guess, get through a day, or I don't know. I mean, it's fascinating the power that certain people have in the words that are used and how it can have a ripple effect through an economy, as you just mentioned.
Yeah.
So let's talk in that term a little bit, not in a negative way, but we're talking about COVID-19 sort of as the core of this conversation. And, we're talking about insights, and what I kind of want to know from your models or from just your own thoughts as a researcher are, what are some of the things that are just permanently changed as a result of this? I mean, what social behaviors or economic drivers are being changed? Like how, we're talking in a format that I would never have used 2 months ago. And here we are, and we're going to do lots of them. But what are some of the new norms, as people like to call them, new norm, that are going to emerge as a result of this based on your research?
So again, I guess I have to sort of cautiously say that
it's all caution. It's okay.
Well, no, I mean, cautiously say that I think we can't assume that what we see today or even what we see next month is going to persist. So again, like, everybody said, cruise ships, nobody was going to go on cruise ships. Now bookings are up, so I think the only thing we can say about the permanent change is that we're going to have to be really vigilant about monitoring this throughout the phases of, for at least for the next 12 to 24 months, that it's now, now that it looks like we're going to be, epidemiologists are saying that this is going to be a prolonged situation of managing the outbreak over this period. And so it's going to, if there is another if we get the outbreak under control and people gradually go back to work, and then there's another outbreak, maybe people were okay going back to work after the first phase of the crisis, but then after the second, they were, this deeper reality sets in and they won't be. So I think we're going to have to keep monitoring that. The other thing is, of course, that, the longer this goes on for, the more the certain sectors that have been deeply impacted and others that actually have, are kind of more pandemic proof, we may see a more permanent reshaping of what the economic reality and structure looks like here in Canada and the US. We're already seeing a little bit of this happening in China. As I mentioned, we're having, we can see that those people in our data, those people who have a history of studying in the STEM professions are actually having much better employment outcomes. We know that certain groups of our, in our data in Canada and the US, we can see that certain groups of people, of course, are more able to work from home, whether you're in education or tech sector. People like us are able to work from home. And so, we're going to be able to see, the degree to which that changes the economic reality and the distribution of jobs, or the sort of the sectors that people are employed in going forward. So we may see some permanent reshaping of the economy, but it's not clear. Again, I think we need to keep challenging that also over time too, because things change.
Yeah, the role of manual labor. I mean, the one trend around robotics and moving things
Yeah.
to from manual human labor to robotic labor. I mean,
Yeah.
geez, if there was never a better case study for that
Yeah.
than what's happening right now, I don't know what would be.
Yeah.
Our whole concept of labor and where it has to be effective, and what a work day is, and all that is complete. It's like you said, the assumptions need to be reevaluated almost every day.
Yeah, and another one that just occurs to me, because I've done a lot of work on the gig economy and sort of measuring gig economy, which is something that's not well measured by our existing technologies. This is like the first major economic shock to hit us since the kind of online platform economy, right? So the ability to
since
use
2008.
Uber. Yeah, so it's really the first time that the impact on those possibilities is being tested. And you can imagine, we can see now there's many more Instacart shoppers and Uber Eats, people doing Uber Eats and so on and so forth. But we may see, as like because our employment and income loss data show that so many people have lost their jobs or their sources of income. We may see a growth in some of these gig economy type work, types of work, which again is not getting captured in our traditional employment data. And so we're going to have to look at that more carefully too, to see what does that mean for the future? What does that mean for the kinds of employment opportunities, particularly that young people are going to be having access to, people who are just graduating from school right now, graduating from university or college right now. What are their prospects going to look like in the short term, but then longer term, because we know that people who are not able to find meaningful employment in their subject area of study now have worse outcomes down the line. And so that's another really important consideration, I think, that we're going to have to monitor closely.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. It's the chessboard changes every day, and you just don't know what piece you are. Can we talk about media a little bit? I want to talk about media. Okay.
Sure.
Because a common question I ask our guests is, where do you get your news? And the reason I ask that, because we're running a stock exchange here at the CSE. We have clients such as yourself. Disclosure and information accuracy, all that stuff is imperative to us having accurate data sets and information to make smart decisions, like buying stocks. Now, the common person does not get an unbiased feed, obviously, through major news distribution sources.
Right.
So where do you guys go to get your news? Where do you get to go your news? Because you're smart, you know where to go. What do you listen to and read?
Well, actually, I think at RIWI, the company, everybody has their different sources that they like to go to, which is great because we want to have a diversity of opinion and thinking to, again, challenge our assumptions, because that's what we do. But I personally, of course, read, the Canadian media, Globe and Mail and others, Financial Times, try to read for diversity of American media. I think the other thing is I also read it with a major grain of salt, because I like to check it against the RIWI data.
Yeah, of course.
Same with my social media feed. I've had people say, suggest to me, wait a minute, how can you say this when my social media feed disagrees with you? Or, protests against physical distancing are one of the examples is right now that, there's a growth in people who are opposed to physical distancing in the US, right? That are protesting. It's
a good headline. I mean, it's a terrible practice, but good headline. I get it.
It's a great headline, but I see, we see total stability in our data around who's not practicing physical distancing. It's about 8% of the Canadian and US online population. It's been consistently so since we started tracking it every day of the crisis. So anyhow, I guess just all to say that I'm a big fan. I don't know if you read Factfulness by Hans Rosling, where he recommends, you should read it. And he basically recommends not reading news because the news is biased. Well, and you have to read it, but you have to read it with a grain of salt. The news is often biased to the extreme. and to the anecdote. And we have to be careful that when we're reading that, we make sure that we are checking those assumptions against the broad-based data that do now exist out there that allow us to check our assumptions again. So that's my take on the media. I read a lot of news, but I'm trying to take
I imagine you do. But it was funny because everyone became a media expert when this thing started breaking out, and they were saying, well, the media sells fear and everyone's overreacting to the pandemic. And then boom, all of a sudden everyone's freaking out and they're going, oh my God, people are dying. This is bad. We got to be really careful.
Yeah.
And it was just a shift. And I'm with you. I mean, I try to read, I'll go to Fox News and I'll go to CNN back to back every day just to see how they're playing off stuff. I don't know why. It's basically just propaganda at this stage, but that's just my opinion, not the exchanges. But but there's always a shred of truth in there, and then you look at some of their social channels and stuff, and you can kind of pick up on what the world is sort of interested in. The news aggregators that you get sometimes when you open up your browser, like I use Bing. I don't know why. The aggregator they throw at you when you open your browser is actually pretty good. There's a ton of crap on there too, but I basically gave up on tech companies giving me news when Apple started giving me BuzzFeed articles in my news screen when I swiped left or swiped right. To me, that's sort of like we just throwing the idea of news out the window at that point. Like, what is news? Why do we bother? But I'll say this about this whole thing that we've been doing here at the Exchange, when people like yourself and together as a community is talking to other individuals and just getting their their opinion on what's going on. Like, we actually weren't doing a lot of that before this all happened. How often would you try to plug into someone's real world situation and just understand and get their opinions and insights? And something as simple as how was your trip to the grocery store is now like a really insightful thing. And I think really that
I was gonna mention there's an economist, former central bank economist named Danny Blanchflower, and he writes about the economics of walking about. And really, hearing from as broad a set of perspectives as you can possibly hear from. And you can get a lot of really great insights from, speaking to people across all walks of life and so on. And that's really what we're trying to do at RIWI is really, hear from as many people as we can across different, broader set of perspectives as possible so that we can really get a true sense of what's happening. And if you speak to a couple of people, about their experience at the grocery store, or their feelings or worries that, can they send their children back? If they live with their parents, can they send their children back to work and go back to work themselves? How are they feeling about all these things, and how are they actually going to act? And that can give you a lot of perspective on what things are going to come next.
Yeah, or me as a person in Newmarket, you in Toronto, looking at a headline about people on the beach in Jacksonville, and very thin line of relation there. So go out into your own community, I guess, and try to figure out what's happening without relying too much on what's happening half a country or world away. I know we were almost running up to the top of the hour, but I do have a few questions, and hopefully you can answer them. Sure. Two of them from our watchers. And also, if you're watching, you want to ask, there's a little question box down below for Danielle from RIWI. Are you okay to talk about the upcoming election just a little bit? Just any insights about, I guess, and I'll set this question up a certain way. This might appeal to you, which is the narrative has typically been around Donald Trump being reelected is that a strong economy is his ticket to reelection. That's it. And this whole thing has impacted the election cycle so abruptly because A, you can't gather, but B, you mentioned job data and 1 in 5 and all that. That's sort of the antithesis of his base's reasoning for supporting him. Yeah. Is the assumption that I'm alluding to, that the economy being impacted by COVID, does that relate to him and his reelectability, do you think?
So, historically, U.S. election, I mean, if you have a strong economic situation, we know that has, made it much more possible, has favored the incumbent. But I think what we know from our experience with Donald Trump is that we cannot rely on history to predict the future. And so as I mentioned before, we at RIWI were able to predict in 2016 that Trump would win. And the reason we're able to do that is we're able to tap into people who are typically politically disengaged and find out who they thought would win in that election. And so that's what we ask people: who do you think will win? Because that's more predictive than asking people who will you vote for, because of people who didn't in that election didn't want to admit they wanted to vote for Donald Trump. Heading into this election, we have been tracking this since October, and what is clear again is that there is not necessarily a one-to-one correlation between the economy doing well and the president's people's views on whether the president will be reelected. And the other thing that is clear is that that this is really changing on a almost daily basis, based on how the president is managing the crisis. So, for example, we know that during the situation when he said we're going to have an Easter reopening to the economy, we know that was actually quite bad for his approval ratings. And we actually saw a drop in the support for him in the Midwest for the first time since we started tracking this at RIWI earlier in the fall. So, but then again, when he kind of went back and said, oh, no, we're going to close until the end of the month, we saw some, improvement in his ratings. And actually in the last couple of weeks, we've actually seen more, that there's that there's an edge for the Republicans over the last couple of weeks, at a time when we know that more Americans have told us that they're heading into a recession. So, we're actually seeing at the moment in our data, we're seeing an inverse relationship than what we might have seen in the past. Will that continue? We don't know yet, but we will be continuing to track this. So, so be in touch if you would like to know the answer to that.
Yeah. I guess if I'm going to read between the lines, is that perhaps the inputs that made him electable in the first go around are going to change. The variables are different. It's because the playing field is different, and not to mention the competition is different, and it may not be as strong as it was before. Well, we don't know. Those are my assumptions.
We also just don't know who is going to. So we know now who traditional polls missed in the 2016 election when they were trying to predict it. We don't know who we're going to miss in advance. So we just know that we have to get out. It's sort of this economics of walking about, or hearing from the broadest set of people to really understand, despite what's happening in the media headlines or in social media and our social media feeds, we have to really make sure we're getting access to the broadest base of opinion possible to see what's truly going to shake out in the end.
And you mentioned that data. I just want to, because this was a question. Are you collecting? You mentioned real time. Does that mean you get a data point and right away it's modeled, or you refresh every 24 hours or week, or how do you do that?
So when we say real time, it's near real time, right? Yeah. So within the data are collected in real time, and then our screens. It's a cloud-based dashboard that's refreshed, every hour. So it's continuous, 24/7. 365 days of the year data collection, so we're not dealing with time of day bias. A lot of other data collection methods do that, but yeah, it is near real time, in which you would actually be able to see the changes in data. So if we put a question in field, so for example, one of the things we're doing now is looking at the reopening period and what that's going to mean. That implies a whole different set of questions than we might have asked last month. And so once we put those in field, within we start collecting the data right away, and we can see the results right away of how is this really impacting people. Wow.
Well, where should people keep following your insights and getting more information from your team?
Come to us, RIWI.com, or follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn. And and please also, if people have suggestions of ideas of things that we should be tracking in the days ahead, both on the economic side or on some of the public health questions, we would love to hear your suggestions as we continue to figure out and monitor some of these things in real time.
Yeah, I mean, my assumption is that more people grew pandemic beards than not, but who knows? We don't know that until we do a mass survey.
Collect the data.
Very important. Yeah, exactly. Okay, don't make it anecdotal. Thank you, Danielle. That was amazing. My mind is spinning. My mind is blown. Our viewers, thank you so much for tuning in to this Friday edition of Instagram Live with Danielle Goldfarb from RIWI, symbol RIW on the CSE. This interview is going to be on CSE TV on YouTube, so it's going to live on forever. So we will check all these assumptions a couple months from now. But thank you so much for your time, for your knowledge. Great job with you guys at RIWI. And without further ado, have a wonderful weekend. And thanks again.
My pleasure. Thanks. Great time. Thank you.
All right. Take care.